Right, when we talk about the genetics of ancient Egypt, I want to interject something here that I've left out of a couple of other videos, and I want to put it in. There's always these thoughts running through my mind, and indeed I wing it. I should probably make a checklist, but I usually just wing these off the top of my head. What I want to bring about the point of is something that the genetics that they found, whenever they recently found that they were more closely related to Europeans through their haplogroups and alleles than they were even modern Egyptians that are in the spot. They only had about a 1% connection. All Europeans seem to have a 50 to 60% connection. There's a 70% connection around Britain and those Europeans there. And indeed, in that population, there are some 92% matches, which is an incredible match. It also shows that the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas, was in this same pattern too. And if they could get the DNA out of a lot of elder kings and stuff, they would probably find that they are closer related too. But what that shows, and what I've spoke about in that video, but didn't go into it in depth, or didn't put enough weight or levity to it, is the fact that whenever they did the 1300 years of genetic studies, that they didn't go, or they were able to go from before the Hyksos were actually in Egypt. So that would have been before the Canaanites and guys came in now from the northern Anatolia area and brought the horses down with the chariots and so on that they didn't have. They had donkeys and so on. And so they were able to go from mummies from before then till through the Middle Kingdom all the way towards the end. And what they were really expecting to see was a dramatic difference and change, like, oh, here come the Hyksos, and look, it shows up. And then, oops, here's where the Greeks take over finally, and it shows up. Oh, and back here's where the Nubians in the 25th dynasty finally took over for a while, and then there's some Negroid DNA mixed in here, and it continues on, so on. Whoa, here's Romans, and things like that. But what they found is that it all seemed to have a continuity to it. And people wonder why you would have a continuity when you see something like that. And indeed, this is the way that it shows up as a correlation to it. And what we're finding is people in Britain and Ireland, things have a 80% match, not the 72, but upwards of 80 in areas. 60 comes around in 50 or so. There are certain areas that have 40-25, but then all of this diaspora that you see through here. Now, this is not from King Tut himself. King Tut was too young whenever he died to have fathered all these people. In fact, we know today that King Tut's children were born, stillborn or deceased. They even have the mummies for him and so on. And so it showed that he didn't pass on. So how does this show up? Well, it seems to be that his great-great-great-great-granddad were blending into these people, were these people. It's not even Egypt went to these areas, but it's people from these areas formed Egypt. Way, way back, they went from here all the way slowly around all of the Mediterranean and ended up down there. Now this mix, the reason it's so much less is because all the Arabian and diaspora from the east that came in, right? Okay, and this matches out to that fact. The reason it seems so strong over here is because there's the stories of like Scotia, Queen of Scots, who is said to have come from Egypt at the time of the Hyksos Exodus, and indeed there are hundreds of thousands of mummies that are blonde and blue haired and separated as such. So there's blondes over here and blue eyes and redheads over here, separated in the actual necropolis itself. It's believed that they may have separated themselves in that manner. You wouldn't separate or change your family. You'd have a bunch of blondes. They'd have a redheaded kid. Well, he'd be a Seth worshiper, but he wouldn't be. When he died, he would be born and would be buried in the Seth area. They didn't have family burial plots. That really only happened for the kings and his wife and so on. And later it even shows up to where they have the diaspora of the family to connect to him. But that's not happening on the regular and the commoner people. They're just trying to be born in the necropolis itself and have the caretaker of Anubis over them. So how would this show up to be the same in the continuity? Well, it's whenever the Mitannian people that were giving princesses who ended up breeding and causing heirs of Egypt that are from the Anatolia area and all up through here, that they were the same people in essence, and therefore it doesn't show much change. You don't see a big, whoa, look at this, type things show up. It doesn't show that way. And indeed, whenever Greeks and Romans come down and mix with the population, you don't see it then either. And the reason you don't see much change at all is because these people aren't much different than them. I'll give you an example just mentally here. People in America have come from all over Europe and settled in America. Now, there's Greek guys that got with Irish women, and they've had children and so on. And so if you looked at their DNA, you might be able to figure that out. But if a Greek or an Irishman came and moved to America, here's a migration, and was to marry one of those kids' offsprings, then it wouldn't show up a radical change because, again, that's a Greek or an Irish person, and it's not changing the DNA. It's not warping it because its percentages are changing somewhat, but it's possible haplogroups and most of your alleles aren't even going to change during that, and you don't see much change. This is what those guys are alluding to whenever they say this thing. And this lets you believe more and more that Europeans had more to do with it. Now, are we talking about Europeans from 1700 AD? No. We're not even talking about Europeans from 1700 BC. We're talking about Europeans from 17,000 BC that spread out around through ancient Aryans, who spread out around through and down and into Egypt and stayed in Egypt and formed it as they found the fertile valley and the place that they could live there, just like the Sumerians did in their area, India did in its, and so on. So I just want to point that out, that the non extensive changes that they showed in that genetic twist is it's going to make it real hard for us to figure out the exactness of it. You can tell just off of the logic and concept to it. It's kind of hard to see back blending with people, like it's going to be hard to see back blending with Americans whenever Americans are truly Irish and Europeans and Greeks all mixed together somewhat, And so how can you see a back blend on something that's a blend of the original blend? If it stuck out like a sore thumb, like the Sub Saharan African DNA does in the later samples, they can say, well, here it happened. And so on. So, but what they can't say is here it happened before, because it was kind of the same thing. They almost have to see a few more skeletons and go, okay, they were like this, then they were more like that, then they were more like this. And here comes in this allele, here comes in this mixture of haplogroup at this point. Where does that come from? Well, over here at around 6,000 BC, we have the same people with the same alleles. There's trade in between them. We can figure that out. So here you go, and things like that. So just more of an overlook. I'm not a geneticist in any way, shape, or form. I understand the concept like this. Not that I could get down and actually do a test. It doesn't need that to do it, to analyze information. But, I stand on the shoulders of experts and just correlate information, research, and then figure out and then try to correlate that data into something that's usable for all of us. Anyhow, like, share, and subscribe. Peace.